There's a war happening inside every mid-size office in the country right now, and it doesn't look like a war. Nobody's shouting. Nobody threw a chair. The manager sent a Slack message asking for a little extra effort this quarter. And the 23-year-old on the other end read it, looked at their screen, looked at their studio apartment that cost $2,200 a month, thought about the fact that their salary hasn't moved in 2 years, and typed back, "Sure, I'll take a look." And then did exactly what they were already doing, nothing more, nothing less. The company called it disengagement, the internet called it quiet quitting. I called it the most rational economic decision that generation has ever made. And the people most upset about it are the people who benefited the most from the previous deal. That's the thing we need to talk about. We're going to explain how the unspoken contract between workers and companies actually works, why that contract collapsed, and why the corporate world is only now realizing the ceiling fell in a long time ago. This isn't a video about Gen Z being lazy. This isn't a video about hustle culture versus self-care. Those are the wrong frames entirely. This is a video about incentive structures, broken systems, and what happens when an entire generation does the math and decides the machine isn't worth feeding anymore. The metaphor I want you to hold in your head throughout this entire video is a vending machine, not a metaphor about hustle or ladders or whatever LinkedIn uses this week. A vending machine. Specifically, imagine a vending machine that has been running in a corporate break room since about 1985. The deal was simple. You put coins in, your time, your health, your loyalty, your identity, and the machine gives you something back. Security, a pension, a house, a title, a retirement at 65. The deal worked. Boomers fed that machine their entire lives, and most of them got what was advertised on the display window. Then something happened, and Gen Z walked up to the machine, looked at the display, put in the coins, pressed the button, and the coil turned once and stopped, and nothing came out. They pressed the button again, nothing. They looked at the display, the items were still listed. Job security, home ownership, upward mobility, comfortable retirement, all still there on the screen, but the machine was empty, or broken, or both. Oh my, here's the first thing people get wrong. They think Gen Z stopped feeding the machine because they're soft, because they want everything handed to them. Because Instagram rewired their dopamine because they didn't suffer enough. That's not the analysis, that's just an older generation projecting their own psychology onto a different set of circumstances. The actual reason Gen Z stopped feeding the machine is simpler and more boring. The machine stopped paying out, and they noticed. Let me walk you through what I mean. The deal that built corporate loyalty for 3 or 4 decades had a very specific structure. You give us your best years, your overtime, your health, your weekends, your identity. You make the company your personality, your tribe, your primary source of social meaning, and in return, we will take care of you. Stable employment, gradual pay increases, a defined benefit pension, healthcare for life. If you're good enough, a house in the suburbs and maybe a lake house later. The deal wasn't just transactional, it was almost religious. Companies didn't just want your output, they wanted your allegiance, and millions of people gave it, and most of them got paid. Here's when the machine broke. Starting roughly in the 1990s, something began shifting quietly in the background. Defined benefit pensions, the kind where the company actually guarantees you a monthly payment in retirement, started disappearing. They got replaced with the 401k, which sounds like an upgrade until you realize that in the old model, the company absorbed the investment risk, and in the new model, you absorbed it. The risk was transferred to the employee. That's a massive structural change, and it happened so gradually that most people didn't fully register it. Then wages started stagnating. Real wages, inflation adjusted, the kind that actually tells you what your money buys. Corporate profits were climbing, productivity was climbing, CEO pay was climbing, but median worker compensation was not climbing at the same rate. For a period of about 3 decades, from roughly the mid 1980s through to recently, the gap between what companies extracted and what they returned to the workers doing the extracting quietly widened. Then housing prices happened. In most major metros, from San Francisco to Austin to Boston to Miami, the average home price inflated at a rate that made the old deal mathematically impossible for anyone entering the workforce after about 2010. A Gen X worker who graduated in 1994 could, with reasonable financial discipline, buy a home on a single professional salary within a few years of starting work. A Gen Z worker who graduated in 2023 is doing the math and the number doesn't close. It doesn't close if they work hard. It doesn't close if they sacrifice. It doesn't close if they eat rice and beans and skip vacations. In many cities, the math just doesn't work. And here's the number that I think is the most quietly devastating piece of data out there right now. Only 41% of Gen Zers expect to own a home one day. Not are struggling to buy, not are saving up. 41% think home ownership is even possible for them at all. 59% have written it off. And home ownership was one of the core items on the vending machine display. It was one of the things you were supposed to get in exchange for feeding the machine your whole career. So when you look at a 23-year-old who works their contractual hours and refuses to volunteer extra effort without extra compensation, and you call them lazy, you are looking at someone who has correctly identified that the machine is broken, and you're angry at them for not putting more coins in. That's the actual dynamic. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but some sacrifice is part of building a career. You have to invest before you get returns. That's how careers work. And you're right. That logic holds. I apply it myself. The issue isn't sacrifice. The issue is the expected return on that sacrifice. If I put $20 into a stock and get $2 back and you tell me to put in another 20, I'm going to ask you to show me the math first. The math has changed. The expected return on sacrificing your health for a company has declined substantially. And Gen Z is the first generation that grew up with enough information access to actually see the historical returns on that sacrifice, compare them to current projections, and say this does not pencil out. That's the first cycle. The deal is broken. Gen Z noticed. They stopped feeding the machine. Older generations call it laziness. It isn't. Now let's go deeper because the deal being broken explains the initial behavior, but it doesn't fully explain why the boundary setting has gotten so much more explicit, so much more public, and so culturally specific to this generation compared to, say, millennials who also got a bad deal. The answer is health, specifically mental health. And this is where it gets interesting because the mainstream framing, companies should support mental health, employers should be compassionate, we need wellness programs, is about 70% wrong on the mechanism. Let me explain what I mean. Gen Z grew up during a period of significant societal and economic upheaval, from the financial crisis of 2008 to the COVID-19 pandemic. A survey by Deloitte found that 46% of Gen Z respondents report feeling stressed or anxious all or most of the time, far surpassing other generations in terms of mental health challenges. Now, the corporate response to that statistic has been largely, okay, let's offer an app. Let's do a wellness webinar. Let's give people access to a therapy service through their benefits portal that has a 4-week waitlist. Problem solved, right? Instead of real solutions, they're getting pizza parties and self-care webinars. But here's what nobody in the HR department wants to say out loud. The mental health crisis Gen Z is experiencing is not separate from the work environment. It is largely caused by it. The stress is not incidental to the job. In many cases, the job is the source of the stress. The top driver for those who cite their job as contributing significantly to their stress and anxiety is long working hours for 48% of Gen Zers, followed by not being recognized or rewarded adequately and toxic workplace cultures. So let's do the math on that. The machine is asking you to put in more coins than ever, more hours, more availability, more emotional labor. Be on Slack at 7 p.m., answer emails on Sunday, be enthusiastic in all hands meetings, and in return, the machine gives you a $40,000 salary in a city where a one-bedroom apartment costs $2,200 a month, which, if you're doing arithmetic at home, leaves you with roughly $400 a month after taxes and rent. In San Francisco, that math is even worse. In New York, that's not a life. That's a waiting room. Nearly three quarters, 74% of Gen Zers say they have needed to take time off work due to stress, although only 43% actually took this time off. And think about that gap for a second. 74% needed to take time off. 43% actually did it. The other 31% kept showing up, kept performing, kept feeding the machine, even though their body was telling them to stop. Because the system penalizes people who don't. That's not wellness culture. That's not a we support mental health company. That's a machine that takes coins regardless of whether the person feeding it can afford them. And Gen Z looked at that dynamic, watched their parents and older siblings do it, saw what it produced. Chronic health problems, late career burnout, identities completely fused to a job title that could be eliminated in a restructuring on a Tuesday afternoon, and made a different choice. Gen Zers are 1.7 times more likely than members of other generations to step away from leadership roles to protect their well-being. Only 6% of Gen Z respondents say their primary career goal is to reach a leadership position. 6%. The people writing think pieces about Gen Z's lack of ambition are looking at this number and going insane. But think about what leadership actually looks like from a cost benefit perspective for someone entering the workforce in 2023. More meetings, more responsibility with proportionally less increase in compensation, more political exposure, more identity fusion with the company, more availability expectations, more of your personal brand tied to something you don't own. You become a middle manager. The machine made you part of itself. And when the machine gets upgraded or downsized or acqui-hired, you go with it. Oh, as a result of this shift, 80% of HR professionals say they lack confidence in their leadership pipelines, with CEOs ranking that concern among their top 4 concerns. And there it is. That's the second order effect nobody expected. Companies spent decades quietly breaking the deal, assuming workers had no alternative, assuming the next generation would behave like the previous one, assuming the machine would keep getting fed. And now they're looking at the talent pipeline and the pipeline is empty. Okay, I want to be fair here because this video is not a Gen Z fan club and I'm not here to tell you that refusing to work is a financial strategy. It isn't. Let's be precise about what the actual data shows because the nuance matters. The mainstream take has two wrong versions. Version 1 from older generations. Gen Z is lazy, soft, addicted to phones and doesn't understand that hard work builds character. Version 2 from certain Gen Z content creators. Work is exploitation, rest is resistance, boundaries are sacred, your dream job doesn't exist. Both of these are COPA. Both of them are emotional reactions dressed up as analysis. Here's what's actually happening in 3 layers. Layer 1. The most financially vulnerable Gen Zers are the ones working the hardest for the least return. They're in service jobs, in call centers, in fulfillment warehouses, in corporate entry level roles that used to be stepping stones but have become dead ends. Nearly half, 48%, don't feel financially secure in 2025, compared to just 30% who felt the same way in 2024. More than half are living paycheck to paycheck, and over 1/3 struggle to cover basic living expenses each month. These people aren't quiet quitting, they can't afford to, they're grinding and still losing. Layer 2, the Gen Zers who are actually setting health boundaries, who are declining the overtime, refusing the Sunday emails, leaving jobs after a year, are mostly the ones who have enough skill or enough alternative income to afford the choice. This is a selection effect nobody talks about. The people with leverage can afford to have boundaries, the people without leverage cannot. Boundaries are partially a class behavior. Don't confuse cultural trends in one segment of a generation with universal behavior. Layer 3, and this is the most interesting layer. There is a subset of Gen Z, small, largely invisible on social media, who are doing neither of the above. They're not grinding themselves into the machine hoping for a return, and they're not refusing to work. They're doing something structurally different. They are extracting skills and capital from employment while simultaneously building leverage outside of it. They work the job, they learn from the job, they keep their health intact precisely because they know a depleted asset can't compound, and they're quietly building the infrastructure for a life that doesn't depend on the machine at all. That third group is the one I actually find interesting to study. But before we get there, let me tell you a short story. Not my story specifically, I've observed this pattern enough times that it's basically a template now. Imagine a 24-year-old, let's call him Marcus. Marcus gets a job at a mid-sized tech firm in late 2022, base salary of $62,000 a year. His manager is pleasant enough. The company has a ping pong table. They do a big Slack celebration whenever someone lands a new client. On Marcus's second week, his manager pulls him aside and says, "Hey, I just want you to know, the people who get ahead here are the ones who go above and beyond. We notice that stuff." Marcus nods. He's smart. He files that away. For the first 6 months, Marcus goes above and beyond. He works 50, sometimes 55 hours a week. He answers messages at 9 p.m. He volunteers for the projects nobody wants. He makes himself indispensable. He gets a good performance review. He gets a raise, $3,000. His new salary is $65,000. Now you might think that's how it works. You pay your dues, you build up, you get there eventually. And that would be true if the math scaled. But Marcus ran the numbers. He put in roughly 500 extra hours over those 6 months. $3,000 annualized. He made roughly $6 per extra hour, below minimum wage in most states, for someone with a college degree in a knowledge worker role. Meanwhile, his cortisol is elevated, his sleep quality has dropped, he's getting weird tension headaches. He stopped going to the gym because there's no time. He's using his lunch break to answer emails instead of eating. He has stopped seeing his friends on weeknights because he's too tired. Marcus looked at all of that, added it up, and quietly recalibrated. He didn't quit. He didn't post about it on TikTok. He started working his 40 hours cleanly and efficiently without the extra 5 to 15 hours of unpaid performance. He started going to the gym again. He started sleeping 7 to 8 hours. And crucially, he started spending 3 to 4 hours a week building something on the side. Within 18 months, his side project was generating $1,400 a month. Within 30 months, it was generating $4,500 a month. When the company announced a restructuring and his team got halved, Marcus wasn't devastated. He was already mostly out the door. He negotiated a severance, left clean. Now, here's the thing I want you to notice about that story. The corporate system would diagnose Marcus as a quiet quitter, a disengaged employee, a problem case, but Marcus was making the most rational financial decision available to him given the actual incentive structure in front of him. He wasn't lazy, he was reallocating effort to where the marginal return was higher. And this is what I mean when I say most people are attacking the wrong thing. The conversation about Gen Z's health boundaries isn't really about health, it's about the return on input. It's about a generation that has correctly identified that the traditional vending machine isn't paying out and is deciding rationally to stop putting full coin. If you've been watching this and finding yourself nodding along more than you expected, this is the kind of systems analysis I do consistently. The subscribe button exists, one click every time I publish something like this, you get it. That's the only pitch I'll make. Let's go deeper now. Because we've established that a deal is broken and Gen Z noticed. We've established that the health boundary isn't softness, it's rational allocation. But there's a third layer that I think is the most counterintuitive thing I want to say in this entire video, and most people will disagree with it until they sit with it for a few days. Here it is, the companies complaining the loudest about Gen Z's lack of loyalty are, in many cases, the ones who destroyed the conditions for loyalty in the first place. I want to be precise here because I'm not blaming CEOs or pointing at individuals. This is a structural argument. The incentive system inside public companies created a specific set of behaviors at the leadership level which produce specific outcomes for workers, which produce specific behavioral adaptations in the next generation of workers. Nobody sat in a room and decided to break the deal. The deal broke as an emergent property of the incentive structure. Here's the mechanism. Starting in the 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s and 2000s, public company executives became increasingly compensated through stock options and equity. Your pay as a CEO became tied to the stock price. Your stock price is influenced heavily by quarterly earnings. Quarterly earnings are influenced heavily by labor costs. Labor costs are one of the largest line items in most companies. So the incentive system told executives very clearly and at the compensation level, minimize labor costs, maximize short-term returns, cut benefits, shift risk to employees, replace full-time workers with contractors when possible, hold salary increases below productivity growth, keep the difference. Nobody was being evil, they were responding to incentives. Every actor in the system was doing what the system rewarded. But the cumulative effect, compounded over 30 years, was the systematic hollowing out of the employment deal. The machine was quietly emptied of product while the display window kept showing the same items. Despite record corporate profits in sectors like tech, healthcare, and logistics, real wages have barely kept up with inflation. Rent, education, and food prices continue to rise. Quiet quitting has become a survival strategy, not a protest. This isn't ideological. Gen Z is not staging a political movement against capitalism. Most of them would genuinely prefer a functioning deal. They would prefer a machine that paid out. They're not romanticizing the refusal to engage. They're adapting to an environment where the old engagement model produces negative expected value. Now, here's where it gets genuinely weird. And this is the part that I find fascinating from a systems perspective. According to a 2025 Gallup poll, 59% of workers globally are not engaged at work. That's the highest number since 2001. Since 2001, the highest disengagement rate in almost a quarter century, and the Gallup engagement framework has been measuring this for decades. This isn't a blip, this is a trend that has been building for a long time and is now cresting. Think about what that means at the company level. 59% of your workforce is coasting. They're present, they're technically performing, but they're not innovating, they're not going the extra mile, they're not having the 10-minute conversation with a colleague that accidentally produces a breakthrough idea. They're clocking in and clocking out, biologically present but psychologically absent. The machine is still getting coins, but it's getting the minimum coin, and companies are starting to realize that you can run an organization on minimum coin input, but you can't grow one, you can't innovate. You can't build culture, you can't retain institutional knowledge, you just have a building full of people completing tasks. And here's the painful irony. The companies that hollowed out the deal to maximize short-term financial returns are now discovering that the long-term cost of a disengaged workforce is enormous, not just in productivity loss, in innovation loss, in talent attrition, in the cost of replacing employees who leave, which, depending on the role and seniority, typically runs between 50 and 200% of that person's annual salary. Gen Z's average job tenure is just 1.1 years compared to 2.8 for Gen X. Let me do the math on that for a second because I think it's worth sitting with. Imagine a company with 500 employees, a third of whom are Gen Z. That's roughly 167 Gen Z employees. If the average tenure is 1.1 years and the cost to replace each employee is conservatively 60% of their annual salary, say the average salary is $55,000, The replacement cost per person is $33,000. Multiply that by the attrition rate, and you're looking at potentially millions of dollars per year in replacement costs alone. Not counting the lost institutional knowledge, not counting the productivity gap while the new hire ramps, not counting the damage to morale on the remaining team. The companies that cut the deal are now paying a completely different kind of price, and the people managing the HR crisis are not the same people who made the structural decisions that caused it. The executives who hollowed out the deal are largely retired or in their 50s and 60s looking at golf courses. The HR managers dealing with the fallout are in their 30s and 40s running engagement surveys and wondering why the ping pong table isn't working. Imagine a manager in 2024 explaining to a 22-year-old why company culture should matter to them. We're like a family here. Cool, does the family match my 401k? We have unlimited PTO. Cool, can I use it without getting informally penalized? We have a ping pong table, silence, and a snack wall, and more silence. Okay, but like, the mission is really, what does the mission pay per hour? I want to stop here and challenge something that you might be building toward as a counter argument, because I've heard it a lot and it's partially valid. You might be thinking, okay, but successful people sacrificed their health in their 20s and built great things. Elon Musk worked 100 hours a week. Steve Jobs was obsessive to the point of dysfunction. The founders of great companies routinely destroyed their health in the early years and it worked. Fair, that's true of a specific kind of person in a specific kind of situation. Let me tell you why it doesn't apply to what we're talking about. There's a massive difference between sacrificing your health for equity in something you own and sacrificing your health for salary in something you don't. This is the key distinction that gets missed in every conversation about work ethic and Gen Z. When you are an employee, your input, your time, health, energy, creativity converts into output that belongs to the company. The company captures the residual value. If your effort produces $1 million in revenue and you're paid $65,000, the company captured the remainder. You are a cost center on a spreadsheet. Your sacrifice increases someone else's equity. When you are building something you own, even partially, a business, a product, an audience, an asset, your input converts into equity that belongs to you. The sacrifice still exists, but the ownership of the upside is different. So when older generations say I worked 80 hours a week and it paid off, the question I want to ask is, what were you building? Were you building your own thing or someone else's? Because those two scenarios have fundamentally different financial structures, and conflating them is the reason most career advice sounds inspiring but produces middling results. Gen Z at its most sophisticated has actually started understanding this distinction. Not universally, there's a lot of noise in the space, but the signal is there. 52% of Gen Z professionals are freelancing, meaning over half of this generation is already participating in the gig economy rather than traditional employment. That number is staggering. Half of a generation has at least partially stepped outside the traditional employment machine. Some are doing it out of necessity, some are doing it strategically, but the structural direction is clear. The machine is losing its monopoly on young people's economic participation. Now you might say, but freelancing is precarious. No benefits, no stability, no clear path. And you're right, for a lot of people, freelancing as a primary income is actually a worse deal than employment, especially early in a career. The instability is real. The lack of employer-provided benefits is a real cost. I'm not here to tell you to quit your job and become a freelancer. But the interesting thing isn't freelancing as a replacement for employment. The interesting thing is what freelancing as a supplement to employment signals about how people are starting to think about leverage, risk, and income architecture. People are starting to understand that having one income source controlled entirely by one entity that can eliminate it on a Tuesday is a fragile position, and they're building redundancy. That's not laziness, that's financial engineering. Terrible financial engineering in a lot of cases, but the instinct is correct. Let me tell you about the 4 traps that keep people locked inside the machine even when they know the machine isn't paying out fairly. Because understanding this is more practically useful than anything I've said so far. Trap 1, lifestyle expansion. You get a $65,000 salary, you adjust your spending to $62,000, you buy a slightly nicer apartment, you lease the car instead of driving the old one. Now you need the salary to maintain the life. The machine has you, not through force, through comfort. Every lifestyle upgrade is a coin you've preloaded into the machine that you can't get back. This trap is not unique to any generation, but it's particularly aggressive now because the advertising infrastructure around Gen Z is the most sophisticated in human history, designed by the best behavioral scientists money can hire, optimized to get you to spend slightly more than you earn. Trap 2, identity fusion. You make the company your identity, your title, your team. I work at Google, I'm in consulting, I'm a brand strategist at a Fortune 500, and then a restructuring happens and your team gets cut, and you don't just lose income, you lose who you are. This is the most psychologically devastating version of the machine breaking down. Companies have historically encouraged identity fusion because an employee who has fused their identity with the company is harder to lose and easier to motivate. It's a feature for them, it's a liability for you. Trap 3, the escalating bet. You've already given 5 years, so the logic goes, I've already put this much in, I might as well stay until a return comes. This is the sunk cost fallacy dressed in career language. The 5 years are gone. They're not an investment in the future. They're just gone. The question is whether the next 5 years are likely to produce the return you're hoping for based on what you can actually observe about the machine's current condition. Most people don't ask that question explicitly. They just keep putting coins in because stopping feels like losing. Trap 4, the invisible floor. This is the most subtle one. You don't leave bad employment situations because your threshold for bad enough to leave keeps adjusting downward. The first year they give you unrealistic deadlines, you're stressed. Second year you've adapted. Third year it's normal. Fourth year you've forgotten that it wasn't always normal. The floor drops. Your baseline for acceptable conditions gets recalibrated by exposure. You've been gradually acclimatized to a temperature that would have shocked you on day one. These four traps, lifestyle expansion, identity fusion, the escalating bet, and the invisible floor, are the mechanisms that keep people inside machines long after the machines have stopped paying out fairly. And they're not personal failures, they're systemic features. They're what the machine is designed to do. Imagine your company sends out a mental health awareness email on a random Tuesday. Remember your well-being matters. Check out our meditation app. And then 30 minutes later, same email thread, same manager ads. Also, just a reminder that the Q3 deliverables are due Friday, not Monday. Appreciate everyone's flexibility. The meditation app is load-bearing architecture at that point. Now let's go to the fourth level. And this is where I think the whole conversation about Gen Z and health gets genuinely interesting from a wealth building perspective, because there's a question nobody is asking, and it's the most important question in this entire conversation. The question is, what is your body actually worth as an asset? I know that sounds cold, it kind of is, but hear me out because this framing changes everything. Your capacity to generate income, your skills, your energy, your cognitive function, your creativity, your judgment is an asset. It produces cash flows. Those cash flows over a 40-year career represent the most significant financial asset most people will ever own. Not their house, not their 401k, their human capital, their ability to show up and produce. Now, what happens to that asset when you run it at maximum output without maintenance? What happens to a machine you never service? What happens to a car you never change the oil on? It degrades and then it fails. 71% of Gen Z employees have unhealthy work health scores compared to just 42% of baby boomers. At 22, at 25, at 28, the asset is already showing degradation. Now, here's the thing, companies will never tell you because it's not in their interest to say it out loud. They don't care about the long-term maintenance of your asset. They care about maximizing the output of your asset during your tenure at their company. After you leave, through attrition, restructuring, or retirement, the asset is no longer their problem. Any depreciation you incurred during your time with them is your problem to carry forward. So when a manager says we really need you to put in the extra hours this quarter, what they're actually saying, if you translate it into asset language, is please draw down on your long-term productive capacity in exchange for a short-term company benefit, and we'll give you a $3,000 raise to justify it. And the $3,000 is not the price of the asset depreciation, it's almost certainly less. This is why the health boundary isn't softness. At its most sophisticated level, it's asset management. It's someone saying, I understand what my productive capacity is worth over a 40-year horizon, and I'm not going to sell it at this price. Now, to be fair, most 23-year-olds are not thinking in those exact terms. Most of them are just exhausted and instinctively protecting themselves. The rationalization comes after, but the instinct is economically correct even when it's not articulated precisely. 40% of Gen Zers feel stressed or anxious all or most of the time, with much of that stress stemming directly from their work environment. Chronic stress is not a personal problem. Chronic stress is a documented, measurable form of physical asset depreciation. Elevated cortisol over extended periods degrades cognitive function. It degrades immune function. It shortens sleep quality, which degrades decision-making capacity, which degrades everything downstream. A person running on chronic workplace stress for 3 to 5 years is not the same asset they were at the beginning. They have materially lower productive capacity, higher health risk, higher psychological fragility, and the company that ran them at that output level will hire someone new because the new hire is cheap and the old hire is depleted. This is the deal stated plainly, and Gen Z, whether they can articulate it or not, is the first generation that has enough information through social media, through mental health discourse, through visible examples of burnout in their peer group and in the generations slightly above them to feel the shape of this deal and reject it instinctively. Older generations might have pushed through burnout, but Gen Z is walking away from jobs that drain them. Gen Z isn't waiting until they're 40 to start valuing work-life balance. And this is the part that baffles the older framework. Because in the old model, you were supposed to sacrifice in your 20s and harvest in your 40s. That was the timeline. Pay dues now, collect later. But there are two problems with that model in the current environment. Problem one, the harvest in your 40s is no longer guaranteed. The machine might not be there, the pension is already gone, the job security is gone, the collect later part of the equation has become much less reliable. Problem two, the sacrifice in your 20s is more expensive than it used to be, because the information environment Gen Z grew up in has made them acutely aware of what chronic stress does. They've watched older siblings and parents arrive at 40 with back problems, anxiety disorders, and identities that collapse when the company downsized. They've seen the harvest fail, they've seen the price of sacrifice up close, and they've decided it's not worth paying at the listed price. Let me give you the system summary of what's actually happening because I want to be precise and not just descriptive. The corporate employment model was a system with three components: input, processing, and output. Input, labor, health, time, loyalty. Processing, the company's business operations. Output, compensation, security, advancement, identity. Over roughly 4 decades, the output side of the system was degraded, security went away, advancement became less reliable, the compensation to productivity ratio declined. Identity fusion remained because it was cheap to offer and expensive to remove. Gen Z entered the system, observed the input-output ratio, identified the degradation, and began optimizing input downward to match actual observed output. This is rational behavior in a market system. If the price of an asset drops, rational buyers reduce what they're willing to pay. The companies calling this disengagement are essentially complaining that their customers are behaving like rational buyers. The problem isn't the customers, the problem is the product. Now, here's what I think is the single most interesting practical implication of all of this, and it's the part that most videos about Gen Z workplace trends completely miss. The response to a broken machine is not to refuse to use any machine, it's to find a better machine or to build one. And the people in this generation who I think are most clearly thinking about this correctly are not the ones posting about work-life balance on TikTok. They're not the ones writing essays about hustle culture being toxic. Those are people describing the problem, which is useful, but it's not a solution. The people who are actually navigating this well are doing something very specific. They are using employment as a temporary input mechanism, extracting skills, income, and networks while simultaneously building leverage outside of it. They are not emotionally fused with the company. They are not sacrificing their health for returns that may never materialize. They are treating the job as a funding mechanism and a training ground, not as a destination. Gen Z's average job tenure is just 1.1 years, but it's growth hunting, not job hopping, that drives this mobility. And that reframe is important, not job hopping out of dissatisfaction. Growth hunting, moving when the extraction rate of skills and opportunities at the current company drops below what's available elsewhere. That is rational portfolio behavior applied to career decisions. You rebalance when the asset no longer performs. Let me give you the framework that I actually think about when I observe this stuff. Three types of people in the workforce right now, and the third one is the one worth being. Type 1, the fully committed. They've made the company their identity. They work the long hours. They believe in the mission. They are genuinely emotionally invested. Some of them will have great outcomes if they're at genuinely exceptional companies with genuine equity upside. Most of them will spend a decade building something they don't own and find out around age 35 that loyalty is not a currency that converts into anything. Type 2, the checked out. They've identified the deal is broken, but they haven't built anything outside it. They're not building leverage. They're not building skills at an accelerated rate. They're not building alternative income. They're just doing less. This is the group that gets called quiet quitters. And to be honest, pure disengagement without a secondary building strategy is just slow motion financial failure. You've correctly identified that the machine is broken. You've correctly decided not to feed it your health. But if you're not building something with the reclaimed time and energy, you're just drifting. You've said no to the bad deal without saying yes to anything better. Type 3, the extractors. They work the job, they extract what's valuable. Skills, compensation, network, market knowledge. They keep their health intact because their health is their primary asset and they understand that. They don't emotionally fuse with the company, they keep the emotional capital in reserve for things they actually own. And they are systematically building something on the side, a skill, a business and investment portfolio, a content presence, a freelance practice that compounds independently of the machine. When the machine eventually breaks down for them, as it will for most people, they're not desperate, they're ready. According to a LinkedIn survey, 72% of Gen Z is the most likely generation to have either left or considered leaving a job because their employer did not offer a feasible, flexible work policy. That mobility is not waste. That mobility is the extraction model in action. Stay until the extraction rate drops, then move. Every move ideally brings a higher salary, more skills, a broader network. Job switching, when done strategically and not emotionally, is one of the most reliable ways to grow compensation in a stagnant salary environment. The people who stay at one company for 10 years hoping for organic salary growth routinely get outpaced on compensation by people who moved every 2 to 3 years and negotiated each time. The machine, if you understand it, can still be used, just not the way they want you to use it. Now, let me pull this back to the beginning. I opened with the vending machine metaphor, the deal that worked for several decades. The coins your parents fed into the machine and the outputs they received, and then the machine getting quietly emptied while the display window stayed the same. Here's the thing I want to leave you with, because this is the insight that actually changes the practical direction of the argument. The machine isn't broken for everyone. It still works at specific companies in specific roles under specific conditions. Early employees at genuinely equity backed startups, people in roles with real skill scarcity who can negotiate genuine upside, people building within companies where ownership of the work product creates actual transferable leverage. The machine pays out when the conditions are right. The mistake is not identifying when those conditions exist and when they don't. Most of the people reading LinkedIn hot takes about work culture are feeding machines that don't pay out, and they're debating whether they should feed it more coins or fewer coins. The more sophisticated question is, am I even in the right machine, or should I be building my own? 2 in 3 young adults, 68%, view their work mainly as a way to make a living, but not as a major part of their identity or personal fulfillment. That number used to be described as disengagement. I think of it differently. I think of it as identity hygiene. When you don't fuse your identity with your job, you retain the psychological flexibility to leave when the deal stops working, to evaluate the deal without emotional distortion, and to invest your real identity, your values, your ambitions, your sense of self in things you actually own. The generation before Gen Z was sold identity fusion as a feature. Be passionate about your work, find the job that doesn't feel like work, bring your whole self to the office. And a lot of people did. And then the office announced a restructuring and their whole self had nowhere to go. Gen Z largely is not making that mistake, and whether they can articulate the financial logic or not, the behavior is correct. Don't give the machine your identity, use the machine. Extract what's valuable. Keep your health intact because it's your compounding asset. And build leverage outside the machine so that when it breaks, and at some point it always breaks, you're standing on something else. Okay. 3 practical things, non-generic, actually useful. First, map your extraction rate every 6 months. Not just am I happy here. Specifically, what skills have I gained in the last 6 months? What is my compensation relative to the market rate for my skills? What is my network growing into? If you cannot answer those questions clearly, or if the answers suggest low or declining extraction rate, you are in the wrong machine. Move faster than feels comfortable. The social pressure to stay longer than the extraction warrants is one of the most reliable ways to lose career years. Second, your health is a compounding asset. Treat it with the same seriousness you treat any investment. Sleep specifically is the most leveraged health variable in terms of downstream cognitive and physical performance. Every hour of chronic sleep deprivation from work-related stress represents a real measurable decline in your decision-making quality, your risk assessment, your creative problem solving. You cannot earn your way out of asset depreciation. You can only prevent it. The hours you protect for recovery are not wasted hours. They are maintenance on the system that generates all your other outputs. Third, build something you own in parallel always. It doesn't have to be a business. It could be a skill set so rare and specific that your leverage in the labor market becomes exceptional. It could be an investment portfolio. It could be a side project generating even a few $100s a month. The point is not the scale. The point is the existence of something outside the machine that belongs to you and compounds independently of whether any particular employer decides to keep you on payroll. The companies telling you to put the company first are not doing it because they have your best interests in mind. They are doing it because they have figured out that your self-sacrifice is a significant source of their returns. That's not cynicism, that's just the incentive structure, stated plainly. Gen Z, largely by instinct and partially by calculation, has started to understand that. And the corporations calling it a crisis are correct. It is a crisis for them. It just isn't a crisis for the workers. If this is the kind of systems-based analysis you want more of, subscribe. I put out a new video every week and I'll be here next time.